If you are watching this video, you probably have a package of worms that looks just like this that you probably got today. So if you're still adding your worms to the worm bin, feel free to follow along as I show you how to do this. So it's important to remember that the main goal when shipping worms through USPS is to get them as dry as possible. Water conducts heat and cold really well. And so if the worms are wet, they'll be really susceptible to the extreme conditions that they might be presented with. So Zag cartons here, you can just toss them there to provide airflow. Just make sure the worms can breathe and can have a chance to dry out and everything. So you'll see as I open this, there's a lot of peat moss in here. Same thing, dry out the worms, kind of insulate them. You can get rid of the peat moss if you want. You can keep it. Doesn't really matter too much. Here in the video, I'm going to mix it together with the worms. And you do want to see them real dry like this. Like you want to see them totally coated in peat moss. Like it's almost hard to see the worms. But once I spray them with some water, you'll see all of them a little bit more clearly. But yeah, just get them moist. Get some water on the outside of their skin so they can breathe and everything. This will help them make that final stretch from shipment to their new home and your worm bin. Now, setting the worms aside, you want to make sure you have plenty of bedding ready. You want about a square foot per pound of worms that you have, and that needs to be about 3 inches deep. And so, some pretty important rules for your bedding: you want it to be pH neutral, low in salts, high in carbon, and also low in nitrogen. And you want something that will absorb water very well. Worms need to breathe. They're like us. They need to breathe a lot more than they need to drink, and so or hydration. So you need to make sure your bedding is not totally saturated. All material has a certain amount of pore space that can either be occupied by air or water. You want 60 to 80% of the pore space in that material to be occupied by water and 20% of it to be dry or available for air so the worms can breathe. A couple ways to do this. You can see I'm doing a squeeze test. So if you pick up the water, you squeeze it, and more than 3 drops or so are coming out of it, it's probably too wet. And so you want to get it to a point where only about 3 drops of water comes out. Or you can also get about 80% or 70% or so of your bedding material totally saturated and the other 20 or 30% totally dry. And once you mix them together, it'll be at a 70 or 80% moisture level, which is what we're going for. But now that you can see when I squeeze it, there's still a lot of water coming out, and I clipped the video a little bit here, but I did add some more dry bedding to it, and now you can see that when I squeeze it, only a few drops of water are coming out, and so I'm pretty happy with the moisture content of this bedding now. Quick interruption. I'm Scott. I'm the owner of Hungry Worms. Thank you for checking out the video. Although you've probably never heard of me or my business, like right now I think we have 3 or 4 subscribers on YouTube. But although you haven't heard of me, we're one of the biggest vermiculture operations in the country. We've done most of our sales and orders operating under different brands, so fulfilling orders and shipments for other brands instead of really building my own on a national scale. And so Hungry Worms is me creating my own brand. So if you like learning about commercial worm farming or just worm farming in general, producing high quality worm casting, soil microbiology, things like that, then consider subscribing. Check out my other videos, and as they say, smash that like button. Thanks. Now it is time to add the worms. So one thing that I always tell people who are starting is you want to give worms their free choice to move into the bedding or to not. I'll show you an example of what it shouldn't look like a little bit later. But you can see I'm not mixing the worms into the material because, if you're using a bedding that you've never used before, you don't necessarily know how the worms will act to it. So give them the choice to move into it or not and kind of pay attention to see what they do. I added a few worms that didn't have peat moss mixed with them so you could see more clearly this time lapse. They should burrow down into their bedding right away like this. This is an example of what you hopefully shouldn't see, so I intentionally added a bunch of salt, and they'll act the same whether it's salt or pH or other things, but I intentionally added a bunch of salt to this bedding mix and placed a worm on it. Again, I'm letting the worm communicate to me. I'm letting the worm tell me if the bedding is good or not, because if I were to force this worm into this bedding, it could kill him because it's so salty. So you can see obviously he's unhappy, and it'll look like he's starting to burrow down into the bedding, but then he stops, pulls his head back out, and he starts traveling just horizontally across the material, always peeking down a little bit, but never actually burrowing. He'll keep going from just traveling horizontally across the material. So if you're seeing that happen, you can assume there's probably something up with your material, whether it's high salts or low or high pH or something to look into. And if you're having trouble getting your worms into the bedding, feel free to give me a call. My phone number is on the website, hungryworms.com. By the way, this worm was rehomed into a CFT, so he is okay. He did not die. And as you worm, you'll kind of learn how to communicate and how to listen to your worms, I guess. Kind of the same idea as putting the worms on top of the bedding and giving them the choice to move into or not. When you first start, you'll want to add your food, these things that are potentially more volatile because they're higher in nutrients. Put them just in a corner or a section of your bin. I like to bury them, just make sure they're in contact with the moist bedding so they don't dry out. But this gives the worms the chance to move into it or stay away from it. And you can kind of see if the worms like the food or not. So you can just ask the worms if they'll eat it because you just put it in one corner and see if they go for it or not. And that way, if you add something that might kill them or heats up too much, if you leave half of the bed, half of the bin alone, they can just escape to that half of the bin and just hide out there. And then cap it off with something to keep them from drying out. Make sure there's enough airflow, and you should be golden.